I do a whole lecture series on that. But Nietzsche is more concerned with this half than this half, right? So we can see that a little guy, a little girl who doesn't have physical strength in the world, and I'm just situating this in terms of the body. Foucault would desubjectify the relationship. He wouldn't talk about this in terms of the body, but I have to do a lecture and I don't want to be too abstract. So I'm situating it in the body, knowing that Foucault wouldn't have me situated in the body. But the idea is, well, I'm small, I don't really have a lot of strength, I don't have muscles, but I got a lot of brain power. And I can use my brain power to control, to dominate, to get ahead, to overcome for whatever physical disadvantages I have. And you can see that there's going to be a disequilibrium, right? I'll never be as big as this person is. I just can't grow to be 6'6", 250. I'm not going to be that guy. And this person is never going to have the mind that I have. So insofar as we try to arrive at some balance, some egalitarian distribution of power throughout the social nexus, you're wasting your time. You're wasting your time. There's always inherently going to be disequilibrium in the distribution of power. And this is an example to make that sort of abstract idea concrete, and I think that should be absolutely clear. Now, if we get that, let's apply this to the occupation movement specifically. So I'm going to give you an example and apply it to the occupation movement. Occupationists should recognize that the occupation movement is a non-egalitarian relation to the status quo. You have to recognize the disequilibrium in power. You have to recognize the power that exceeds the power of the movement, even as it is fully realized, and the power inherent in the movement, the power to mass coordinate millions of people. That's a lot of power. The power that, insofar as the mass coordination of millions of people can be used to send a global signal to the world that this is what we stand for, this is what we're going to do, and then participants uniformly adopt that standard, that's powerful. That's powerful, right? That's very, very powerful. And what will end up happening is that those who are in power currently, globally, will have to recognize, will have to bow, not necessarily in a docile act, right, but in an act of recognition and respect. They will have to bow to the organizational might of the occupation movement, and that's, for me, where the occupation movement stands to benefit the most. And I know that people think that this is going to be a fad, but I'm putting in my 2 cents, and I'm definitely doing my labor. We're 3+ hours into the lecture now, not including all the footage I shot at the actual protest, plus, the bit that I did in exchange with other people. But just this lecture series alone, 3+ hours, and hopefully this will be up here for years to come. This is my attempt to keep fueling the fire, right? Because I believe in this movement, and I want to see where it will go, just out of curiosity's sake, if nothing else, right? So, occupationists should recognize the occupation movement is in a non-egalitarian relationship to the status quo, where it is subordinated by the power of the status quo. The status quo is going to try and silence and suppress the occupation movement. And you've seen these videos, right? You've seen what's going on in Australia. You've seen what's going on in Phoenix. You've seen what's going on in San Diego. You've seen what's going on in Wall Street. You know that there is increasing tension. But you also see images, hopefully more, of people falling in love, meeting each other, great human stories, great social stories, great globally social stories of the benefit that the occupation movement is giving these individuals in society, right? Hence the importance, the absolute importance of social theory, right? This is a social movement. This is a social movement. However, also, it is currently and will continue to subordinate the message of other emergent movements currently vying for recognition. The occupation movement has to recognize that insofar as we talk about the social nexus, and imagine that we have a spot open on the social nexus here, right? There's a potential spot open on the social nexus. All of these spots are occupied. We know that these spots are force relations. We know that the force relations are adaptable, changeable, transformable, all interlaced within the larger social construct. We know that. I talked about that already. And there's a new opening. And you have the occupation movement as next up. But behind the occupation movement are a whole bunch of other movements, are a whole bunch of social transformations that want to, this is just an example, want to take this position. Now, this would be the status quo. And I'm trying to give you just sort of hypothetical so you have an understanding. Right? It's more complicated than this, but if you can get this, you'll be able to have a very, very complex discussion at a very abstract level, because sort of the image is in mind, right? There's an opening. There's an opening on the social nexus. And the occupation movement is trying to jump in on that movement. And the status quo, is trying to prevent the occupation movement from jumping in. So you can see that there's going to be there's a resistance. And we'll talk about resistance movements in a bit. There's a resistance, a back and forth. I want to get in. No, you can't. I want to get in. No, you can't. Insofar as the occupation movement wins and secures its position, it does so at the expense of all of these other movements. So you have to recognize that there is a non-egalitarian relationship. Yes, the occupation movement and all other movements are great if they try to establish themselves on the social nexus, in the social nexus, for the betterment of society. But insofar as they occupy a position, they sort of conceptually push another movement to the side. Right? So someone won't have their voice heard because all of this international media attention is being focused on the occupation movement. Another emergent movement that was attempting to try and gain international recognition has now fallen by the wayside because the occupation movement is so dominant. If I were still a young graduate student and I heard this lecture, I would try and see, well, what other social movements sort of were spawned at the same time as the occupation movement, and why haven't those social movements risen to international attention? We know why they haven't, because the occupation movement has dominated our sort of media, now our academic landscape, thanks to me. So I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing, right? I recognize that insofar as I am here as a professor, not necessarily condoning the occupation movement, but giving a huge lecture series to something that could be faddish, I recognize that insofar as I do this, I have been co-opted, in a sense, to suppress the voice of possible other emergent movements. I recognize that. The point is, I don't have a problem with that because I recognize that. What you should do is recognize, however, listen, I love the occupation movement, I'm all for it, however, this is not my cup of tea. This is not something that really affects me. What really affects me is this X movement over here. And these guys have been working for years, for decades, to try and get their voice heard, and I'm going to try and do the best that I can to bring voice to that movement. For me, the occupation movement is precisely what I'm interested in, and I'm in a position to give voice to that movement, so I will give voice to that movement. But as you guys know, as a global educator, I'm not onto faddish, poppy stuff. The occupation movement, I'm not doing this lecture series because it's the cool new thing. I do Nietzsche and Ayn Rand and Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics and Jose Ortega y Gasset, stuff that nobody's ever heard of, right? For the most part, the general public's never heard of any of this stuff, especially like Gasset. It's not about the occupation movement being the new cool thing to do. That's interesting to me. What's interesting to me about the occupation movement is that the occupation movement is quickly rising in power. But insofar as it rises in power, it is subordinating inherently other movements. And the question is, I'm going to help the occupation movement rise to the highest height that it can rise to. What you need to do is recognize that, hey, I'm glad Dr. Campbell's doing that. I'm going to try and find some other movement and give voice to that movement because of this inherent non-egalitarian distribution of power, to be technical, right? So, very, very important. The second thing, so that's the first point, right? The first point is there's always going to be a non-egalitarian distribution of power along the social nexus. Just to give you a little taste of the real deeper aspect, not just sort of movement-specific aspect, just for those of you who are curious, how does this unfold within Foucault? For Foucault, this disequilibrium distribution of power is in turn capitalized on, not necessarily in the financial sense, but possibly, is capitalized on by institutions that situate themselves to benefit from the non-equilibrium distribution. What does that mean? There's no surprise that, and actually this idea comes from Pogobat. Shout out to Pogobat. Pogobat did an amazing video, which was my default video for a while on YouTube, about his critique on education. And he made some really, really good points in that video. And one of the things he said was the university was the place for huge social transformation across the globe because the university housed individuals who were motivated to increase their intellect. It's not anything inherent in the university. The university just simply said, hey, here's where you stop if you want to work on your brain. People who wanted to work on their brains stopped at the university, and then they took the knowledge from the university, went back into society, and transformed the society. What Pogobat said, which was interesting, however, is that in a global 21st century internet-based society, he didn't say this per se, but this is more me, our social fabric is being intertwined, as I said yesterday, right? Oh, here's blue. Imagine that blue represents the virtual. Right? Blue represents the virtual, black represents the physical. It used to be the case that our social fabric looked like this. We know that the internet, the World Wide Web, we know that the World Wide Web looks like this. Blue is virtual, black is physical. However, what could it be if both of these social nexus, there is undeniably, it's called social networking, right? But it's virtual social networking. What would happen if we hybridized the two and we had something like this? What would this look like? A real blend between the virtual and the physical to create a truly interwoven social, virtual, physical nexus. What Pogobat says, he doesn't get into this level of complexity, but what Pogobat says, which is sort of a charge to me as an academic, is that education has, in a sense, been liberated. And I really like the idea. And he didn't mean just in the sense that education is now free of charge. It has been freed, right? What I'm doing, my purpose in life, the only thing that I'm really attempting to accomplish in life isn't to amass, a whole bunch of publications under my belt. It isn't to be a talking head on one of the major news channels. It's to tell the virtual world, just like universities told the physical world, that, hey, jasonjcampbell.org, my YouTube channel, is a place that you can come. If you're the type of person that wants to work on your brain, this is the place that you can come to work on your brain. And if 300 people come, then fine. If 1,000 people come, then even better, right? The whole idea is that I'm sending the signal to the world that this is a place that you come to work on your brain and help me work on my brain. What I'm doing, what I'm recognizing, is the occupation movement puts itself in a position, it really puts itself in a position where now you can occupy in the streets, physically, in the streets. You can protest in the streets, right? You can upload your videos to cyberspace, as I've done. So you have physical occupation, you have virtual occupation, and this is what I'm trying to do. I'm going to tell you right now, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say the Occupy movement is not necessarily the first social movement, but it's at least, now, it's, for me, the reason why I'm motivated by it is because the movement serves the ability to take information from the net, take it back to the virtual and make change. Take information from the physical to the virtual and make change, right? And what I want to do is serve as the facilitator to see what this might look like. What would it be to hybridize, to interweave our physical social nexus with our virtual social nexus, such that we have a construct that is both a social construct, right? That is both physical and virtual. And obviously Facebook has done this, right? Obviously dating sites have done this, right? You meet someone virtually, then you marry them, and you live in the physical world. But usually once you get to that point, then it becomes a physical relationship. The the idea of Facebook is you meet a friend on Facebook, you organize an event, you go to the physical event, you come back, you put notes, fine. What's beautiful about this is that the instruction is a virtual instruction. The transformation is a physical transformation, but that transformation requires more virtual instruction. So I've essentially created never-ending work for myself, which is great because I get bored rather easily, right? So this is my attempt to try and help conceptualize some new stuff, right? This is what I'm trying to do, really, right? So number 2, relations of power are not in a position of exteriority. Let me erase this. So that's the first.